Well, thanks, Ron and Christine. I mean, the answer to the question, should poor people study philosophy, I'll give you at the end. Just keep you thinking. Now, our speaker today, Dan Cornfield, joined Vanderbilt fresh from his PhD work at the University of Chicago in 1980, and he's now a professor of sociology at Vanderbilt with affiliate positions in political science and in American and Southern studies. I've invited him to talk to us today because he's a great communicator and he's working on issues that matter to all of us. He's the author or editor of some 8 books on labor issues and the sociology of work, including Labor in the New Urban Battlegrounds, Local Solidarity in a Global Economy, which he edited with Lowell Turner a couple of years ago. His main areas of interest are in the sociology of work, labor sociology, economy and society, political sociology, labor movements, industrial and labor relations, and immigration. He's the editor of the journal Work and Occupations, and he's directed Vanderbilt's Institute for Policy Studies. Among other accolades, Dan's been recognized by Vanderbilt as a distinguished teacher, and last year he was given the Harvey Branscombe Distinguished Professor Award. In short, he's one of my most visible, active, and respected colleagues. And he's working on a number of local projects here in Nashville. One of them focuses on the careers of Nashville music professionals. He also looks at the one of the groups he's with, looking at the early civil rights movement here in Nashville, and also at immigrant housing issues with special attention to Kurdish communities, Lao, Latino, Somali, and Vietnamese immigrants in Nashville. Now, each session you get a feedback sheet. Do you get one this? You got one this time? No. Every other session, except this one, Vanderbilt's getting poorer too. Running out of paper. A feedback sheet to fill in and comment on the quality of the food and suggest further topics. And I'm sure some of you think we never read these things, but we do. I read them. And a number of people have asked for someone to address the current economic crisis. And today, although Dan will not directly address its causes, he will focus on those who are arguably most affected by it, the poor. Now, as you know, the Bible tells us the poor are always with us. My sense is that today's speaker thinks, on the contrary, that we can do something about their situation. The expression that's in his title, the American Dream, can be understood in 2 ways. First, it's merely a dream, a fantasy, especially for those who arrived on our shores too late or who are crushed by relentless competition. But it can also be understood as a way of life that with effort and luck we can all achieve. That sense of a dream. I suspect that Dan's going to tell us it's not just luck and hard work, but also policy decisions that make a difference to whether you are in luck and whether your hard work will make a difference. Please welcome Dan Cornfield, whose talk today is entitled Pathways Out of Poverty and Toward the American Dream, the Case of Nashville.
Well, thank you, David, for the very kind introduction, and it is really a pleasure to be here with you at this gathering. I see many friends and colleagues and family in the crowd, and I'm also delighted to be working with the public library in this wonderful community forum. I certainly look forward to the Q&A and engagement with you. I might add that the public library has on display several very thoughtfully selected books from its collection on the topic of today's discussion that I heartily recommend to you, so job well done. Last Sunday's New York Times carried a front page story not about Joe the plumber, but about Mark, the ex-executive turned custodian. Having assumed his custodial position after losing his $70,000 management job at a Fortune 500 company, Mark's, quote, tumble down the economic ladder is among the more disquieting and often hidden aspects of the downturn, claims the New York Times. For Mark, the downward slide looms large in his psyche. Quote, and this is Mark now in his interview with the New York Times reporter, there were times I broke down. I broke down thinking, this is what I've become. Mark's dejection over his status degradation shows how an economic depression evaporates the American dreams of millions of status achievers. Mark's downward recessionary slide, however, clouds our view of the millions of families in need who have remained at Mark's newly acquired low status level throughout the growth and decline phases of business cycles over the years. Already before the onset of the current economic downturn, a coalition of community, labor, business, and political leaders, activists, educators, and professional social workers had assembled to combat poverty in Nashville in an effort called the Poverty Reduction Initiative, which seems to be a public-private, loose and wide-ranging coalition of folks that really want to try to combat poverty in Nashville. I'd like to spend just a few minutes sharing with you how the Nashville anti-poverty effort is a case in point for combating poverty in the urban service economy of the early 21st century. So let's just talk a little bit about Nashville and the profile of poverty in Nashville and how Nashville may compare to other U.S. cities in this regard. These are data from the U.S. Census about Nashville. So Nashville, at least going into the recession, had a poverty rate of about 15%, which is slightly above the national average. So it's kind of an average city in the United States when it comes to the extent of poverty. It's relatively low compared to the Tennessee state average, which is 16%. And in terms of health insurance, about 17% of Nashvillians lack health insurance, which is also roughly the national average, another indicator of poverty. What about the gap between the haves and the have-nots? Well, the U.S. government actually calculates statistics called the Gini coefficient, which actually measures the degree of income inequality, the gap between the haves and the have-nots in different cities and for the whole nation. And Nashville, again, is kind of medium in that respect. So some of the cities, U.S. cities that are comparable to Nashville in terms of the gap between the haves and the have-nots would include Austin, Texas, Chicago, Dallas, Los Angeles, and Memphis. And cities with less inequality, so approaching greater income equality, would include Charlotte, Chattanooga, and Knoxville. And then cities with greater inequality, a sharper income distribution, would include Atlanta, Birmingham, Boston, New York, and Cincinnati. So when we talk about pursuing, combating poverty in Nashville, there are grounds for optimism. And I'll share those with you first and then talk about some of the challenges that as a community we face in addressing the issue of poverty now or during good times as well. Okay, on the optimistic side, Nashville is based on a service economy. A service economy means that the labor force, people are employed in services such as higher education, government, finance, banking, the entertainment industry, as opposed to working in a factory or the manufacturing sector. And that is the wave of the future of the United States. The United States and Nashville are so-called post-industrial societies and economies. And so Nashville's economy is rooted in the growth sector of the national economy. So that's a positive base. Another positive dimension of a service economy is that it's fairly anchored in the community. So the plant cannot pick up and go to another country in search of cheaper labor. It can be automated, like retail. You can buy a lot of things online now, so the service economy is not impervious. It's not to changes that can threaten job security, but it's overall a good type of economy to have in this point in history. And it's a very strong local economy. Again, going into the recession, Nashville really had a very robust full employment economy for about the previous 15 years. So the average annual unemployment rate of Nashville was a very low 3.9% between 1990 and 2007. That is an enviable record of full employment. So as a community, we're entering into a very dire recessionary period from a position of relative economic strength and momentum. So that's the optimistic side. Okay. So a full-scale war on poverty calls for both poverty alleviation and poverty reduction. Okay, poverty alleviation means providing the poor with food, clothing, shelter, and health care. And that's typically accomplished by charity and government. And so if there's a poor person out there, they're in need, if they don't have a shirt on their back, you give them a shirt on the back. That's alleviating poverty, but that's not necessarily reducing poverty. It's obviously a very important thing to do in the short run. There's tremendous urgency. But in terms of a long-run solution to poverty, it's only alleviation, as important as alleviation is. Okay, poverty reduction basically means integrating the poor into the local economy as workers in decent jobs. And that's the great challenge ahead of us as a community, is to do that. Okay. Generally, poverty reduction and poverty alleviation are accomplished by citywide social planning that entails needs assessments and planning and coordination of service delivery. And this is a process that I'm very pleased to say is presently going on in our local government as we speak. So the social services are being restructured and moving in a very constructive direction towards planning and coordination so that we can have, as a community, a maximum outreach in terms of poverty alleviation and poverty reduction in Nashville across the entire county for all different types of poor people, to try to raise the standard of living and equalize the income distribution in Nashville. There are two great challenges to reducing poverty in Nashville. The first is Nashville's hourglass service economy. And for more discussion of the hourglass service economy, you should take a look at one of the books that the Public Library has put out on display by David Shipler called, I think, America's Working Poor, something like that. He's the author that has put forth this image nationally of an hourglass-shaped economy. So what is an hourglass shape? Well, of course, an hourglass has an upper bulb and a lower bulb and a very small connecting tube between the two, the upper and lower bulbs. Okay, so the metaphor is that the upper bulb of our labor force and workplace consists of high-wage, high-salary types of jobs, the type that Mark tumbled out of. Mark tumbled out of and squeezed through that small connecting tube down into the lower bulb of the hourglass to his current custodial job. So the lower bulb consists of low-wage jobs. And it's easier to tumble down than it is to rise up in an hourglass-shaped workplace and an hourglass-shaped labor force. So for example, if you think of, say, a hospital might be a classic example of a very important workplace that's anchored in the local community of the service economy. And a worker may start off working on the floor, mopping, cleaning to keep the hospital germ-free and safe for all happy and unhappy participants in the hospital enterprise. And he or she can work very hard and show up to work all the time and have the greatest work ethic, but it'd be very difficult for that person to rise up to, let's say, a level of being a nurse. In contrast, one of the interesting features of the manufacturing economy is the typical manufacturing corporation was shaped more like a pyramid than it was an hourglass. And so frequently in a factory which looks like a pyramid, an industrial pyramid, you could start working on the shop floor, and then maybe with putting in a little bit of time on the job and doing a good job, you might be able to rise to being a supervisor. Now it's true the opportunities for promotion get smaller and smaller as one goes up the pyramid because there's just less space up there, but it's there's bigger space there than there is in the connecting tube between the two bowls of the hourglass. It's very hard to squeeze through that hourglass, and what it takes is not on-the-job training and doing a good job, but basically getting an education, perhaps throughout one's lifetime, to get retrained so that one can jump up out of the lower bowl and into the upper bowl of the hourglass. And that's a real challenge for any service economy. So the trade-offs between a manufacturing and a service economy when it comes to accomplishing the American dream. In the manufacturing era, which let's say in the early 50s was the heyday of the organization man or woman, as we would say now, to climb a corporate career ladder, there was a career ladder that one could conceivably climb, but then all of those companies shut down in the United States and moved outside the United States. So that was the downside of the manufacturing economy, is that there was a career ladder as long as it existed around here, but then it moved. In the service economy, you have the opposite situation. I just noticed another sociologist in the crowd. It's always good to have more than one sociologist around. The service economy has a very truncated, very blocked mobility structure. It's very hard to climb up from the bottom to the top of a service sector workplace, but often those workplaces at least remain anchored in the local community and are less likely than a factory to relocate. So these are the challenges of the service economy when it comes to not only combating combating poverty, but also trying to structure a society in a way to create a viable pathway to the American dream. So Nashville is challenged by being a very successful service economy, but it does have an hourglass-shaped labor force and opportunity structure for accomplishing the American dream. Okay, so that's the big challenge. Another major challenge for Nashville, and this is partly a perhaps legacy of its glorious history when it comes to civil rights and being really setting an example for the world of a nonviolent approach to desegregation. Nashville took its place in history that way, is that the community every day is getting more and more socially heterogeneous or diverse. It's a very complex community that we have here when it comes to the social composition of Nashville. And that's also reflected in the profile, a statistical profile of Nashville's poor that I will now share with you. And you can see, just because of the social complexity of our city, unfortunately, the many different ways one can become poor. It's not just one, there's not just one type of poor person. There many different types of poor people. So I'm just going to rattle off a couple of statistics for you, and you'll just see that the poor are diverse. Okay, so 60% of the poor are female. 37% of Nashville's poor are under the age 16. A third of Nashville's poor over the age of 25 have less than a high school education. So 2/3 have at least a high school education. 46% of Nashville's poor are African American. 12% of Nashville's poor are Latino. Over 90% of Nashville's poor are U.S. citizens. 1/3 are employed. 1/3 are married. And over 1/4 are homeowners. Now, these are 2007 data, which are the most recent data that we have for Nashville, and these are among the best data in the world collected by the premier statistical agency, the U.S. Census Bureau. And so they're very high quality data, but in all likelihood, you know, because they're not recent, I mean, they're not now, probably the number of poor who are homeowners has actually probably declined since the foreclosures have gone up. Okay. What's more, the American dream is more attainable for some Nashvillians than for others. Again, some statistics. African Americans and Latinos in Nashville are 2 times more likely than whites to be poor. Females are 1.3 times more likely than males to be poor. Actually, there's very little difference between foreign-born people and U.S.-born people in terms of their likelihood of being poor. There's a slight, foreign-born people are slightly more likely than U.S.-born people to be poor in Nashville. So very much race, ethnicity, and gender are big contributing factors to disparities or in the attainability, let's say, of some conventional notion, dreamlike, or actually like though it may be, of the American dream. So in order to integrate the poor into the local economy, social planning has to address what the members of my colleagues in the dismal discipline would call the supply and demand sides of the labor market. So that's the language of the economists, but if you think of poverty consists of people who tend to work in low-wage labor markets. One way to get into the labor market and then ascend to a higher level of a higher wage labor market is to prepare oneself for work, and that's the supply side of the labor market, or to prepare the workforce, the workplace, the employer, to hire people to provide people with opportunities. That's the demand side of the labor market. Okay, so I'm coming near the end here where I'll be discussing with you just what might be a very comprehensive approach towards addressing the issue of poverty reduction and alleviation in Nashville and also in the service economy of the United States, because I think Nashville indeed is emblematic of that and has every reason to consider itself to be a role model for other cities to emulate, given the tremendous goodwill that we have in Nashville to try to address the issues of poverty and inequality. Okay, on the supply side, there are a variety of workforce development issues that are steps that can be taken that are crucial for helping folks to open up pathways to the American dream, and not the least of which would be employment, training, and placement services throughout the life course. So we're not just talking about graduating from public school, which is, of course, an all-important objective for people to achieve and for our community to help people to achieve. But because of the hourglass nature of the service economy workforce, once one graduates from school, it's not going to be on-the-job training that's going to lead to the big promotion. It's going to be additional training to jump around that small connecting tube between the two bowls of this hourglass labor force that will ultimately catapult someone upward and presumably help them, prevent them from at least going downward when the next big recession hits. And it can be done, of course, publicly and privately, but it's the idea of doing it over the life course of an individual, a constant eye towards being retrained and a community obligation to constantly nourishing and nurturing its labor force to be retrained so that they can keep up with the work of the service economy. Another time-honored related technique is the union apprenticeships in the building trades. This has been a major avenue of upward mobility for a lot of manual workers, people who come from very humble origins, who then become trained and work side by side, often in a mentoring relationship, kind of like with an athletic coach, who's in the traditional language would be a master workman, and gender neutral language, a master craft person, who would then train the apprentice and pull that person into the trade. And often folks in those types of trades ultimately can bring in six figures, at least during good times. So that's another route that probably needs to be exploited more than it has been for many people. And then certainly getting to work is extremely important, and that's why childcare and mass transit are vital to trying to do workforce development and give people the opportunity to pursue the American dream, is to get them to the workplace. And that's an extremely important issue, especially now that we no longer really have a kind of leave it to beaver household of the 1950s where the adult woman stayed at home and the adult man went out to work. Now everyone works and someone's got to take care of the kids, and so child care is incredibly important if one wants to have a middle-class household with a dual career type of family. Okay, now moving over to the demand side of the equation, how do we try to help people to accomplish the American dream, combat poverty, and reduce poverty? Well, as you can see, the American dream is not equally attainable for all groups of people, especially, as I mentioned before, by race, ethnicity, and gender. And so, despite the fact that we have important federal anti-discrimination laws that are, landmark pieces of legislation, some of which were inspired by the hard-fought struggles in Nashville, Tennessee in the early 60s, we have a very fine legacy of federal laws to smash the glass ceilings of various kinds, but nonetheless the glass ceilings do persist, sometimes intentionally, sometimes just unintentionally. And so all kinds of anti-discrimination measures in the workplace, including diversity training as well, to sensitize people to the many different cultures of people we have working under the same roof, is extremely important to try to, at a minimum, create a productive occupational community in the workplace and then open up promotion possibilities for meritorious workers. Another extremely important traditional pathway to the American dream, again, is collective bargaining and unionization. This has been, along with entrepreneurship, one of the main ways in which many working people have ascended a status hierarchy in our society. Right now, the percentage of the U.S. labor force that's unionized is about the same that's self-employed, about 10%. So 10% of the U.S. labor force is self-employed right now, and about 10% are unionized. The vast majority of Americans, 80% who are working, are doing the third main pathway towards the American dream, and that is what I call the scramble. They're just trying to make it, accumulate as much education as they can, try to connect the dots, make connections with friends and referrals, and just try to scramble up some kind of hierarchy. The two systematic ways of trying to accomplish the American dream through unionization and entrepreneurship are much more infrequent, but those are pathways that do need to be pursued further. And then finally, the way in which we attract new employers to the area, the economic development strategy, should be linked to criteria that include employer commitments to opening up pathways to the American dream for the workers in the area, just as we are willing as a community to make accommodations, public accommodations for private employers who do bring jobs. We of course want employers who are committed to having a safe workplace, who are committed to diversity and equal opportunity, and committed to providing health insurance and other important life-sustaining, family-oriented fringe benefits. I don't know why they're called fringe benefits, because they're so vital. They're not fringe to anything. They're pretty important. And so that, I think this is where the poverty reduction initiative in Nashville seems to be headed right now. It's taking a very wide, a comprehensive look and a deep look at how to strengthen our community, not just our economy, but our community, in order to strengthen the economy, in order to open up many pathways. And I certainly would encourage you, if you're not already, I know many of you actually are already involved in this big effort, but if you're not, I would encourage you to help do the patriotic thing and help combat poverty in Nashville by getting involved with the Poverty Reduction Initiative. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Dan, I'm going to just ask you a couple of questions, not as difficult as the one that Ron put to me. And I guess the first question I would have, just thinking about that, the broader financial economic context that we're all faced by, is whether this is like a good time or a bad time to be trying to address the questions of poverty. And I just ratchet that question up a little bit, because in your formulation, right at the end there, you talked about eradicating poverty. And I'm thinking, eradicating poverty, that sounds like an impossible dream. And I'm just wondering whether, given how pressed we are, all of us, poor or otherwise, whether now is a good time to be trying to solve the problem and eliminate poverty, or really it's a very bad time, or how would you respond to that?
It's an excellent question, David. There are issues of strategy and tactic, and there are issues of value. And so from a values perspective, I can't think of any time over the business cycle or in history that's a bad time to combat poverty. So it should be on our minds all of the time, because that's how we strengthen community and do the right thing by ourselves, among ourselves. In terms of strategy and tactic, well, I mean, most workers know that they shouldn't strike, for example, during a recession. That's a bad time. So they think about things differently when they know they can be easily replaced on the job when unemployment is very high. So the question of the timing of combating poverty, the question really comes down to what should we be thinking about now under these rather dire economic circumstances? Is it an opportunity to reflect about short-run and long-run solutions to the issue of poverty and social inequality in our society. I would argue that certainly a recession like the one we're in now lays bare, is very revealing in terms of some of the inequalities and uncertainties associated with life in an urban service economy such as the United States, including Nashville. Whatever solutions we do pursue, it seems to me, to address poverty and social inequality should meet the urgent needs of the people who are hurting most now. And that would be a short-run approach, which is important. But it should also be done in such a way that we can begin always restructuring, planning, and devising and creating, most importantly, using our imaginations to develop a system for change, a system of a social safety net, a system for opening up opportunities for the American dream that can be applied during good times and bad into the future.
Okay, I'm going to ask you now another question about the American dream. And it goes like this. We've once or twice in these sessions had people talk about environmental questions, global warming and that kind of thing. And one formulation that certainly comes out when I talk to people about this is that the American dream is simply not sustainable for the rest of the planet. I mean, it just is not possible for China and India and Brazil and all those countries for all their people to aspire to and achieve what we think of as the American dream. Not that they don't deserve it, but just the planet simply can't sustain it. And so, because one version of that would be, no, it's the American dream. It's us who are going to have this standard of living and not everyone else. But when we export our movies to the rest of the world and they see how we live and they want what we've got, is the American dream a curse for maybe even for us? Because it's going to be impossible for us to sort of say, well, we're going to carry on with this lifestyle, but the rest of the world's going to have to get used to the fact that it can't catch up. So I guess my question is there a version of the American dream that's not totally destructive as something that can be generalized for other people and that we could still want to hold on to?
Another great question, David, and I wish I could take a philosophy course from you. Because I have the feeling you know the answer to that question.
No, we don't know the answer to any of the questions.
Right, but you ask good questions. And you also have very precise concepts, too. Conceptually clear. Speaking of which, the American dream is different than materialism. The American dream is different than consumption. It's related. Those concepts, material consumption, status acquisition, are related to the American dream. But as I have looked into the American dream recently, and the phrase apparently was first coined in 1931 by a historian named James Adams in a book called The Epic of America. The American dream, and also this has actually come out in my conversations that I've had with many Nashville music professionals, where I've been asking them in 3-hour interviews what their concepts of the American dream are and how they fashion their artistic lives to accomplish the American dream. It turns out that there are many different kinds of American dreams for people, and some of them are material in the kind of conventional sense that many of you might imagine that people might harbor, but others are also much more of a philosophical and political nature about freedom. Especially for artists, it's artistic freedom is part of their American dream and what it means to be successful. And looking back over the meaning of American dream although I did present the concept of poverty as a case of the opposite of the American dream, in fact, the American dream is really defining a relationship between self and society. And so the American dream could be exported in its imperialistic, destructive way of do it my way and we don't care about your way internationally. But it can also be thought of domestically as well as exported internationally as a way of defining a synergistic and humane relationship between self and society. So that how can a society remain collective, remain a social entity, and at the same time allow for individuals to pursue whatever is important to them, which is what the American dream has come to mean over the years. The materialistic and consumptive type of notion of American dream probably is not all that helpful for addressing the global issues of humanity that you're referring to, David.
And yet, the indices of poverty that you're describing are, understandably, statistically based on what income levels?
Yes, absolutely.
So you've got a kind of hard way of assessing what poverty consists in. Right,
and this is something that's greatly debated among scholars and non-scholars, people, and that is there is poverty in the material sense. There's also poverty in the spiritual sense, and in the sense of community as well.
I think we better open this up to the floor.
Thank you. My question is, when you mention eradicating poverty and you think it's possible to totally do that, I want to ask the other question, is it really, really possible? And you look at Barack and Michelle Obama, and I think they are probably the greatest example of the American dream. They took personal responsibility, but what about the people who are in impoverished situations that don't take the personal responsibility or are not educated enough to take the personal responsibility? I zero in on the high percentage you mentioned of female impoverished, and immediately comes to mind unwed mothers with multiple pregnancies. You know, how do we step back before they're even workplace age and try to change some of that behavior without dictating it, because that might be their American dream?
Well, that's a very good question, and it does have to do with the issue of how one, from a policy perspective, how does one understand the causes of a social problem? If there's a social pattern, is it determined by history and the way in which we organize society and our cultural values that may kind of almost predestine some groups of people for failure, however that's defined, or is it a question of individual responsibility? And this is where certainly a philosopher might be helpful in addressing this issue. But I think the American dream is all about, as I said, kind of reconciling self and society, and it has to do with some kind of mutual obligation between individual responsibility and a community's responsibility to help individuals become the productive citizens that they are. So education sometimes about ways to live life in a different way might be the way to help a lot of people extricate themselves from the ranks of poverty. Similarly, eliminating some of the known barriers to upward mobility, such as the marginalization that results from racial exclusion, economic exclusion as well. So there's usually, I think, a full court press on poverty has to perhaps help some individuals who may be less familiar with ways of living a so-called middle-class lifestyle to assimilate that, but it also, such an effort has to eradicate some of the really weighty forces that have kept a lot of people in poverty and perhaps have caused them to develop lifestyles that maybe perhaps are counterproductive to themselves in ways that So I guess that's how I would answer the question. There are major social barriers to upward mobility that cause people to engage perhaps in behaviors that are seemingly counterproductive. The question is how to intervene. If one only intervenes by educating individuals how to live perhaps more fulfilling and productive lives without removing the barriers or the forces that may have compelled those individuals to enter the situation of marginalization to begin with, it would be an incomplete solution to the issue.
Thank you. Next question at the back there. Yeah. And we need a mic up at the front too.
I thought it was very interesting you bringing up the topic of the workers cleaning the floors in the hospitals not having upward mobility, and I wanted to give you very quickly an example of an industry example of exactly why that happens. I worked in the hospital. I ran the education department. Part of the reason, big part of the reason I signed on for the job is they said that my job requirement was to develop a continuing education program as well as a GED program for the people so that they could move up through the ranks of the hospital. And this is in the hospital where they had people who had diligently scraped scuffs off the floor with putty knives for 30 years. So I felt very motivated to do that. It required me to find someone to provide the education. I contracted with the county continuing education program, adult education program, to get the GED program absolutely free. The hospital was not going to even pay for the books or materials or anything. I worked 3 months to revitalize my classroom space to prepare it for that program, including moving my entire computer training lab to a separate building, which was like pulling teeth. I walk into that classroom at the end of 3 months, having gotten everything, the paint done. It was down to getting the carpeting, and someone else is standing in there deciding on the carpeting. And I'm like, excuse me? It was the nurses. They were taking over the classroom after I had done all the work and all the preparation for 3 months to get that GED program. And they weren't hurting me. They were taking it away from all of those people who had worked all those years so diligently in that institution.
Would you like to comment on that, Dan?
I'm sure that was a very frustrating experience, and understandably so. It's clear that it seems to me you were doing the right thing in trying to kind of widen the connecting tube between the lower and the upper bulbs of the hourglass there in that hospital setting. And that's a good example of an approach that synthesizes the self and society, the personal responsibility and the social responsibility. And in this instance, you were representing the social responsibility side by creating some kind of career ladder or opportunity for rising. The individual workers, of course, would have to avail themselves of that, and that's the personal responsibility side. And so it shows that, like, the model that you were pursuing is a synthesis between the self and society. You clearly saw a barrier. The barrier could be opened up, but then it would finally be up to the individual workers if they were going to avail themselves of the opportunity that you were trying to create for them. It's too bad that you didn't have the chance to take it further.
Okay, we have another question up here, and then we've got 2 or 3 more. So try and keep your questions brief and your answers succinct.
Years ago, I worked...
Is this an answer or a question?
It's a question.
I'm teasing.
Yeah. Years ago, I worked for a welfare to work agency out on the West Coast, and many of our clients were, well, they were all on welfare. They were all trying to be upwardly mobile, and some were very, very bright. However, it seemed to many of us that there was a psychological unfitness when they actually went into educational and workplace situations. They were psychically and culturally unprepared for what they encountered there. And our agency discussed the possibility of adding a sort of psychological counseling component to this program, but we didn't have the money, didn't do it. And I wonder if you would like to comment on that.
Well, in sociology, we actually talk about 4 types of capitals. There's financial capital, which is money. There's human capital, which is education. There's social capital, which is connections and networking. And then there's what we call cultural capital, which is kind of like in the everyday language, dress for success. And that's a time-honored method for climbing up the American ladder. So there's nothing unusual about what you just described. And frontal appearance and acting right in a way that is kind of appropriate for the setting it's like smiling and, you know, Dale Carnegie. And so that's not.
They didn't know how to think about it.
Yeah. Well, the orientation just takes a little bit of exposure, and that's been part of the American process since the dawning of the Republic.
Thank you. Gentleman over here, can we give him a microphone? And then to the lady behind.
Thank you. As briefly as I can, I think the current administration and many of its advisors are well aware of the inadequacies of the so-called paper economy or the shadow economy, financial products, and the promises of a basic or a real economy, which, for purpose of discussion, one that hires. And I think they're ready to decentralize and to de-subsidize this corporate economy in real ways, including some of the new programs under stimulus package. Excuse me. 3 areas, and I won't go into them. Privately owned vehicles are very expensive. They use a lot of oil. They carry one person. The second area would be industrial agriculture, which is prone to terrorist attack. It produces cheap food and so forth. And number 3, the financial industry, which I implied, is not dealing with loans to businesses, stimulating growth, hiring people. Does any of this offer you comment?
Well, I agree with you that I think the administration is definitely on the ball, and I think they're really trying to restructure, and they're taking doing the full court press on poverty and inequality and trying to float all boats. That seems to be their approach.
Lady back there. Then there's another lady right across there.
Dan, you have a very educated and sympathetic, and I guess, motivated audience here. So my question to you is, what would you like us to do when we leave here today to make a difference?
Well, if you're an employer, please pay a living wage. If you're an employer or otherwise, but just a concerned citizen, I do recommend that you jump on board the Poverty Reduction Initiative. I think we have a lot of momentum in the city to really address poverty from a very wide perspective. There are a whole bunch of action committees that have been set up, and I would encourage you to jump on board. And just, it's all based on volunteers, you know, people like yourselves.
Okay, 2 more quick questions. One over there, and then one right at the back in the corner.
To what extent does the service economy depend on the big bulb on the bottom? And if so, what can you do to make life in the bulb better?
The first question, you can't have the upper bulb without the bottom bulb. As to whether or not they have to be hierarchically arranged is another question. But all of the work done in both of the bulbs are crucial towards pushing the whole economy forward. And traditionally in the United States, for the people in the bottom bulb, in both the manufacturing economy and in the service economy, when their mobility has been blocked for the kinds of reasons we've been talking about, usually unionization and collective bargaining have been the way in which they've attempted to raise themselves and raise their standard of living.
We've just got one more question,
Okay.
right in the far back corner. Right at the back. I'm sorry about the other questions that we're not going to have time for. But Jan, you're just too popular.
Thank you. I want to make a statement, and then you can tell me whether or not I have
Where are
an
you?
answer,
Where are
okay?
you?
Up in East Tennessee, there was a place called Oakdale, and on March the 22nd, 1929, there was a cloud burst, and then there was torrential rains, and there were deep ravines, and the water came gushing down, washed away Oakdale, came down, washed away Harriman, Tennessee, and left 153 people homeless, killed 20 or 30 people. They never did find all of them. And my folks had a dogwood shuttle mill up on the hill, and it washed it down the river, but their houses were not washed down the river. My folks' houses were not washed down the river. But they stood up there and watched that big flood for days and days. And then when church Sunday came, everybody went to church, they went to houses, and everybody got on their knees and they prayed that God would send relief. And boy, when He sent it, and it was the greatest thing that ever happened in the world. It was flood control called the Tennessee Valley Authority. And then, not only did He answer that and give them all those jobs to build flood control, but He gave them another job a few years later, and it was the Manhattan Project to make split the atom. So, the getting down on your knees and asking for that unseen answer to your problem, do you agree that's a good answer to the problem of the world? Thank you.
Without,
Think what you say now.
it's hard to know if that was a coincidence or a cause, but indeed, and whether or not Franklin Roosevelt was a god. But I will say this: that when I think it was in November of 2006 when Harold Ford was campaigning for the U.S. Senate, in the Sunday before Election Day in downtown Nashville, in front of the Metro Courthouse, there was a big turnout. This senator from Illinois named Obama came down, and what he was talking about was the TVA. Explicitly.
Come back next month, and we'll have another speaker for you.